Oh boy, so I had my work cut out for me today because I was planning to make a video to talk about Rick Tocchet, the Vancouver Canucks coach-to-be, most likely, the Bruce Boudreau situation and everything in between. But, unbeknownst to me, Canucks president of hockey operations Jim Rutherford had himself a press conference earlier today, and it was 50 minutes long. I went out there, listened to the whole thing, took a whole bunch of notes that I thought were interesting. There are tweets of Canucks journalists and people on this beat tweeting pretty much the same things that Rutherford ended up saying, but because it's a long freaking interview and because I wanted to listen to it myself, I just did my own note-taking and had a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about written out on a notes pad here. So even though a lot of these quotes are scattered on Twitter in different places from different people talking about differing things, this is essentially what Rutherford went out there and talked about. In a nutshell, it's 50 minutes long. I thought I'd provide a little bit of a summary, so let's start out with that. But before we get into it, I will leave a link in the description to the Jeff Marek show from earlier today. The reason it's the Jeff Marek show is because what Marek did was essentially rip the entire audio live as it happened and put it on his own show. So that's kind of how I listened to it on repeat and was able to rewind and look at the quotes properly. It's going to be in the description if you want to go ahead and listen to it yourself. It starts at about the 18-minute mark. But the Rutherford press conference opens up with a conversation on Tanner Pearson, how Rutherford heard the comments last week and he was asking everyone about the situation. There also was a doctor brought in, and they pretty much talked about how there have been 2 setbacks in Tanner Pearson's recovery. The media then asked several questions several times as to whether or not they could disclose what those setbacks were, but Rutherford and the doctors said they are confidential. There's no timeline for recovery for Pearson, and they don't want to make any conjectures as to what's going to happen next year either. So, the report we had heard from, I believe it was Rick Dhaliwal, as to whether or not this could be a career-threatening thing, that seems to still be a possibility. Rutherford also talked about Jason Dickinson, because the idea was brought up that, hey, there was a Besser injury before with his wrist, there's a Demko thing that might be on the horizon, there was a Dickinson hand thing earlier as well, and now it's this Tanner Pearson thing. Rutherford said that for Dickinson, the guy played through an injury last season, and that wasn't a hand injury, or he said, in his own words, it was away from the hand, so that does kind of contradict what the Chicago doctors were saying about Jason Dickinson, but it is interesting to note that that was said. But at the end of the day, this press conference in its entirety was supposed to be about Pearson in the first place, which is why they had doctors brought in and they had that conversation. But as the conference went on, of course, the doctors ended up leaving, Rutherford stuck around, and then it was just normal, let's go out there and talk about everything else that's wrong with this team type of time. And that's what they started off with. They asked Rutherford about recalibrating his thoughts on the core and whether or not it's time to change it up. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing here, there were a lot more words said to make it sound cooler, but essentially they asked Rutherford about changing it up, and he says that they have to change it. He's disappointed in the job that he's done up to this point. Rutherford talked about when he first came in Vancouver, he said they needed to have control of the cap, and they haven't been able to do that. They also said they can't make any changes until they control their cap. And when it comes to what changes he's talking about, he's saying changes with players that aren't core players, with other guys instead. However, there may be trades involving core players if it's the only way to get good players back. He thought before that the Canucks would have to do minor surgery, but after some time, he realized now that it is major surgery. And that's kind of the word, or the phrase that have been popping up quite often throughout this press conference, quote-unquote, major surgery, how the team needs to change so much that it's not a minor thing, it's a major thing. Rutherford also said that when it comes to ownership and the Aquilinis, they have not interfered with any decisions he has made, which is Okay, I'll take your word for it, Rutherford. Wink, wink, nod, nod. I'll take your word for it. He also says that they're stuck with contracts that they can't move, and as a result, they can't make any changes yet. There then is a conversation brought up about the idea of re-signing guys like JT Miller and getting a guy like Ilya Mikheyev, even though the emphasis that Rutherford has placed onto this team and its needs is to get younger. And to that, Rutherford says that you have to have players like that on the roster, and that the cap is going up. So even though they can go out there and focus on younger players, they can still shell out a little bit to the guys in the now. That perspective is one that you can definitely disagree or maybe have your opinions on in the comment section below, but I'm just going out there and saying what Rutherford said. Speaking about signing guys like JT Miller, they talked about Bo Horvat as well, and Rutherford highlighted how the Canucks have taken their best shot on Bo Horvat. The contract on the table is fair for what he's done after this year, but under market value for what he has done this year. Rutherford says that we are in a pickle. He's looking for his money, and he deserves it. I don't blame him. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Bo Horvat is guaranteed to getting traded, but it's pretty gosh darn close to see the writing on the wall. I mean, it's very indicative of where everything is right now when Rutherford is saying that, hey, the contract that we have on the table is not fair for him as to what he's done this season. It's been fair to every other season he has had, which is kind of, it makes sense. I think we've been saying this the entire time, that Bo Horvat in this season's worth of play has been so much better than Bo Horvat in every other year. When it comes to the opposite, though, getting younger players and keeping guys like Miller, for example, Rutherford says we're not looking towards a rebuild, we're looking more at a retool. Younger NHL players who didn't work out in their entry-level contracts, giving them a second chance. That's sort of what they're looking at, instead of straight up just getting draft picks who can help in 4 to 5 years. They have to go about this in a way that is not a long-term rebuild, Rutherford says, and hopefully getting younger guys in the NHL with NHL experience. Now, in theory, that's not a terrible philosophy to have. It's just when you take a look at the journey of the Canucks, where they have so few prospects, yet the team is still performing poorly, it definitely doesn't look good, and Rutherford does admit at times that season ticket holders and people in the media who are criticizing the performance of the team, they have a point. But when it comes to just these acquisitions, that is essentially the idea he's looking to portray. Younger NHL players over draft picks. Of course, they're going to try to get draft picks at the same time, but the focus primarily is on guys who have had NHL experience who can probably do better than what they had accomplished on their former teams. He also says that he had started the process a few days ago of contract extensions with Andrei Kuzmenko, which is good to see. They also then ask about tanking and getting to the bottom and drafting Connor Bedard, not necessarily through verbatim, but either way, Rutherford then jokes around saying, I thought we were tanking, we're pretty close to the bottom. And then he kind of clarifies that by saying, yeah, he's not going to tell the coaches and the players to not play hard, which kind of aligns with my philosophy of tanking. There's a difference between players going out there and intentionally losing and the coach going out there and intentionally blowing games, and instead icing a roster that is just more prone to losing because their players are not good or whatever. Rutherford also said that there's a difference there, which makes sense in my mind. And then there's the quote that really ties it all together. I'll say the obvious. We'd all like to get the first overall pick if there's ever a year to get it. He then talks about buying out players, doesn't mention any players by name, but he does say that there are guys that need to be better than what they have shown off so far. And then there are a lot of other questions that just kind of repeat the same things, and I didn't really bother to write them down because it's all sort of just rehashing the same ideas that have been said throughout the rest of the press conference. But either way, this was it. It was 50 minutes long where Jim Rutherford goes out there and answers the mob of Vancouver media talking about what exactly it is this team is able to do in the next little while here. Obviously, he didn't go out there and make things better, but at least he did acknowledge that there have been some problems in terms of the way the management has gone about doing things so far, how it's been unsatisfactory, and how the team still is performing poorly. I do admit it's a good thing, at the very least, that he is saying this stuff. It's just, in my mind, a tad alarming that there hasn't been too much actually done. You can talk the talk, but you gotta walk the walk at the same time. And the Canucks, aside from the Ethan Bear-Peterson trade, haven't really done too much in a significant magnitude to improve their team in the ways that Rutherford said he wants to improve them. And so the Canucks have a lot of work to do. And this press conference went out there and pretty much confirmed that there is still that work on the table, while also giving updates on everybody else, Tanner Pearson, etc., etc. But either way, link in the description to the Jeff Merrick Show if you want to listen to this entire Rutherford thing, as again, it starts at the 18-minute mark of the podcast. But that was it. It was a lot, and I kind of tried to go out there and listen to the whole thing several times just to get an emphasis as to what Rutherford's philosophy is on everything, and I feel like there is a pretty clear idea. It's just, we need to see this put into action now, We'd been hearing a lot of the same things recently, and with this press conference, all we know now is that Rutherford acknowledges the disappointment in how he's built up the team so far and how they've been incapable of fulfilling what they said they tried to fulfill. So, talk to the comments your thoughts about the Canucks, Rutherford, the press conference and everything else, the tanking, the Pearson, the rebuilding, the retooling, the trading away guys, the cap space, Miller re-signing, and everything in between. I hope you enjoyed this Juraj 99, and bye.